Imagine standing in a brightly lit kitchen at night, looking out a window like this one into a pitch-black forest. You can't see anything past the glass, but you get that awful, creeping sensation that something is out there, looking back at you. Diane and Keith Williams lived with that sensation every night. They had just moved into a highly isolated property tucked deep in the woods of London, Ohio. With Keith working days and taking classes at night, Diane spent long stretches of time alone in the house with their young daughter. Within the first few weeks, Diane began hearing heavy, rapid scampering, moving deliberately along the perimeter of the house. It was a rhythmic, purposeful sound that seemed to circle the exterior walls whenever the sun went down. One evening, while doing the dishes, Diane glanced out the window and saw a pair of glowing orange eyes staring back from the tree line. She retreated to the living room on the other side of the house, hoping to escape the gaze, but the eyes were already there. They were pressed directly against the living room glass, positioned at the height of a standing adult man. Typical woodland animals flee from bright light and human movement, but this presence did the opposite. It held its ground, deliberately tracking Diane from window to maintain eye contact. Diane called 911, but by the time the police arrived to sweep the property, the woods were empty. They found no broken branches, no disturbed dirt, and no physical evidence of an intruder. When Keith arrived home to find the police, he struggled to believe his wife's account. As a hunter who spent his life in these woods, he assumed Diane was experiencing cabin fever, scaring herself with shadows and reflections while he was away at school. For the next month, the woods remained silent. The scampering stopped, and the eyes disappeared from the windows. The family eventually settled back into a normal routine, convinced the threat had simply moved on. They spent those weeks enjoying the quiet, unaware that the silence was temporary. The arrival of the winter's first heavy snow would provide the physical proof that Diane hadn't been imagining the intruder. Early one morning in December of 1981, Keith headed out in the dark to get breakfast for the family. As he slowly adjusted his rearview mirror, he saw a massive, dark figure standing directly behind his car. He jumped out with a flashlight, but the figure had already vanished into the darkness. This time, the visitor left a trail. In the fresh snow, Keith found a series of clear, 14-inch bipedal footprints. They were elongated, tipped with claw marks, and spaced out in a heavy, upright stride. Keith followed the tracks to the side of the house. The prints led directly to the wall, launched onto a first-floor overhang, and then continued up the vertical siding until they reached the second-story roof. The trail ended on the roof and didn't reappear until 20 feet away from the house. Whatever was on that roof had leapt 2 stories down and cleared 20 feet of ground before landing and running back into the forest. Keith called his hunting partner, Dennis. Both men grabbed their rifles and began tracking the prints deep into the woods, determined to find where a creature with that kind of agility could be hiding. The physical evidence pointed to something with strength and coordination beyond any human or local animal. To climb a vertical wall and clear a 20-foot jump, the entity was operating with superhuman mechanics. These specific traits, the upright posture, the 14-inch tracks, and the glowing eyes, match a regional legend known as the Dogman. While the cryptid theory fit the tracks, Keith and Dennis were about to find a much more tangible suspect. The tracks eventually led them to a tiny, isolated cabin in a clearing. It belonged to an older man named George, a local mechanic known for being a recluse. To confirm their suspicions, Keith and Dennis visited the tire shop where George worked. When the towering mechanic stepped out of the shadows, Keith saw the exact glowing orange eyes Diane had described through the kitchen window. George stopped and stared at the 2 men who had stood outside his cabin door only hours earlier. He didn't ask them why they were at his shop, and Keith didn't mention the tracks. They stood in a tense, heavy silence, with George watching them from the shadows, as if waiting for their next move. Keith realized he couldn't involve the police. He had no proof of a crime, and reporting George would mean admitting he had stalked a neighbor to his home while armed with a rifle. The encounter left them with a disturbing question. Was George a man mimicking the behavior of a monster, or was he a monster attempting to live the life of a man? 3 months later, George passed away. With the resident gone, Keith and a local police officer entered the cabin to see what George had been hiding. The cabin's main room was nearly empty, containing only a single chair and a table. But behind a sheet hanging on the back wall, they found a heavy, sliding metal door. The door opened into a hidden cell. The walls were lined with plate steel, held together by heavy rivets. In the center of the floor was a 10-foot chain ending in iron shackles designed to bolt down a pair of wrists and feet. Deep, frantic scratch marks scarred the steel walls from top to bottom. The air inside the windowless room carried the heavy, unmistakable scent of wet dog. The reinforced steel and the heavy chains suggested the scampering sounds and 20-foot leaps weren't coming from a resident, but a prisoner. Something was being kept in this room, something with enough strength to require a steel tomb. One possibility is that George was a captor. He may have spent 40 years keeping a cryptid locked in that cell, only for the creature to occasionally escape and stalk the Williams family. But the shackles and George's own orange eyes suggest a different conclusion. The cage might have been built to hold George himself, a place where he could be bolted down whenever his own nature began to change. The day George died, the activity at the Williams property stopped. The tracks, the scampering, and the eyes at the window vanished and never returned. Keith and Diane lived on the edge of a mystery that was never fully explained. They were left to wonder if their stalker was a man with a dark secret, or a predator that George took with him